Okay, let's dive into something a little bit philosophical here.
Yeah.
Just imagine you're trying to come up with like the best way for society to make decisions.
Yeah.
Taking into account everybody's individual preferences. What kind of like fundamental challenges do you think you might run into when you're even like trying to get started with that?
That is such a great way to frame this, because it brings up all these like really deep questions that philosophers have been wrestling with forever. Just the sheer diversity of viewpoints that people can have, and the fact that, those viewpoints, they clash, they conflict. And then on top of all that, you have this question of what even is a legitimate decision? Like philosophically, what does that even mean?
Exactly. And like that problem of taking all these individual preferences and somehow knitting them together, weaving them together to some kind of collective decision, that's what we're going to be looking at today.
Mm-hmm.
We're diving into Arrow's theorem, this huge result in social choice theory. I mean, it really made waves in economics and political science, obviously, and philosophy. And it really forces us to like rethink how we make decisions together, to even rethink the very idea of like a social will. Like, does that even exist? Because what Arrow actually proved was that if you have more than two choices, you can't have a perfectly fair and rational system. Not if you want to stick to certain reasonable rules.
Oh, yeah. And anybody who's ever thought about how democracy is supposed to work, or even, just making decisions in a group, Arrow's theorem will definitely give you some food for thought. I mean, it gets right to the heart of whether it's even logically possible to have a way of making decisions that respects everybody's individual freedom and somehow comes up with a sensible outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. So your mission, if you choose to accept it, is to really understand this really influential but admittedly complex idea. We're going to break it down for you, lay it all out, show you the key parts, the surprising conclusions, and how it all links back to these big philosophical questions about rationality and about like the values that shape our society.
And to kind of guide our deep dives here, we're going to be looking mostly at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Arrow's theorem. It's this really great overview that manages to be both super rigorous and surprisingly easy to grasp. I mean, they've done a really good job of, laying it all out.
So what was this core problem, this big like philosophical nut that Kenneth Arrow was trying to crack?
Yeah. So at the heart of it all, Arrow was wrestling with this question. How can we possibly, and I mean in a way that makes sense, take all these different rankings that individuals have of like different states of affairs, whether those are, policies or political candidates or even just different ways society could be set up. How do you take those rankings and combine them into a single collective ranking for the entire society and do it in a way that's, fair and that respects individual autonomy? He was basically searching for like this gold standard, this principle for moving from those individual rankings to a single social ranking.
And it sounds like a really simple idea, doesn't it? I mean, we vote, we take polls, we do this all the time. But, as we've been kind of hinting at, it gets complicated fast. To see just how fast, let's look at this thing called the paradox of voting. It's sometimes called Condorcet's paradox.
Mm-hmm.
And it shows us, even in a really basic scenario, this idea of like a clear will of the people, it kind of falls apart. And what Arrow would later prove was that this isn't just some weird quirk of this particular voting system. It's like a deeper logical problem.
It is. It's this classic example that perfectly shows just how tricky it can be to take all those individual preferences and just add them up to get a consistent social ordering. Okay, so picture this. We've got three choices in front of us. Let's call them A, B, and C. And we've got three people who need to decide between them. Now, person one, they rank the choices like this. A is better than B, which is better than C. Person two, they have a different idea. They say B is better than C, which is better than A. And person three, they come in with C is better than A, which is better than B. So we've got three people, three totally different rankings. Now, what happens when we try to figure out what the group as a whole prefers? Let's say we use a system where we compare the choices two at a time and just go with whichever one gets the most votes.
Okay, so like a head-to-head matchup. Let's start with A versus B.
All right, so A versus B. Person one and person three, they both prefer A over B. Person two is the only one who prefers B over A. So it's 2 against 1, which means A wins that round.
Got it. A beats B. What about B versus C?
Okay, so now it's B versus C. Person one and person two, they both prefer B over C. Person three is the outlier, preferring C over B. So again, it's 2-1, meaning B is socially preferred over C.
Makes sense. So A is preferred to B and B is preferred to C. So, like, logically, we'd expect...
Yeah, you'd think A would be preferred to C. Right, but hold on. Let's see what happens when we actually compare A and C directly. Person 2 and person 3, they both prefer C over A, while person 1 is the only one who prefers A over C. So guess what? It's 2-1 again, but this time, C is socially preferred to A.
Wait, what? That's a loop. A is better than B, B is better than C, but C is better than A. It's like going in circles forever. So even though each person had their own perfectly logical ranking, when we try to combine them using this seemingly fair method of, like, majority voting, we end up with something that makes no sense.
Right, and that's the paradox. You see, like the Stanford Encyclopedia puts it, we don't actually have a social ordering at all. We have a cycle. This just shows you how even when individuals are perfectly rational, the choices of the group can end up being completely irrational. Each person can get their best outcome if they just pick their favorite in a head-to-head comparison, but the group as a whole, there's no single best choice because there's always going to be some other choice that a majority prefers in a different pairing. It's a bit mind-boggling, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So Condorcet showed this problem with one particular decision-making method. But Arrow, he went way beyond that, right? He wasn't just looking at voting systems. He was trying to figure out something much deeper.
Exactly. Instead of getting bogged down in specific methods like Condorcet's or, board accounts or whatever, Arrow took this much more abstract and foundational approach. He asked this really big question. What are the core properties, the things that any fair and reasonable way of combining preferences should have? So he came up with this set of criteria, these things that seem on the surface like, duh, obviously any good system would have these. And then he asked the big question, is it even possible for any system to have all of these things at the same time? So going back to that thought experiment of designing the perfect decision-making system, it seems that Arrow might have shown that actually some of the things we think are essential for perfection are, in a way, incompatible with each other.
So he set the bar for what a good system should look like and then asked, okay, can anything actually live up to that? That's incredibly ambitious.
It was. And to do this properly, rigorously, he had to create a whole formal framework. First, he defined a set of alternatives, the things we're choosing between. Let's just call them like X, Y, and Z to keep it simple. And then he defined a set of individuals, the people who are doing the choosing.
That's us, right? The people with the preferences.
Right. And then he said, okay, how are we going to represent each person's preferences? And he decided to use something called an ordinal weak ordering. Now, bear with me for a second because this is important. Ordinal just means that we're only concerned with the order people rank things in. Like, do they prefer X to Y or Y to X, or are they indifferent? We don't care about how much more they prefer one over the other, just the order. Now, Arrow had some deep philosophical reasons for doing this. He thought that trying to compare how strongly different people feel about things is basically impossible. It's like comparing apples and oranges. You can't really say that one person's love for chocolate is stronger than another person's love for, pizza. There's different things. So by just focusing on the ranking, Arrow avoids this whole messy question of how much someone prefers something, which, let's be honest, can be a huge can of worms.
It makes sense. So it's just about the ranking, from most preferred to least preferred. And what about that weak ordering part? What does that mean?
Right. A weak ordering has these two really important properties. It has to be complete, which means that for any two things, a person can always say whether they prefer one, the other, or if they like them equally. And it has to be transitive, meaning if they prefer X to Y and Y to Z, then they got to prefer X to Z too. That's kind of like basic logical consistency, right?
Yeah.
And the weak part just means that we're allowing for ties. Someone might think that two things are equally good.
Okay, I'm following. So each person has their own complete and transitive ranking. What's next?
Next up is the preference profile. It's just a fancy way of saying we're listing out everybody's rankings, like a snapshot of all the preferences in the society. And then the really important part, we have the social welfare function. This is the rule, the mechanism, the thing that takes all those individual rankings and spits out a single social ranking for the whole society. Arrow even called these functions constitutions to show how fundamental they are.
And that output, that social ranking, it also has to be a weak ordering, right? Complete and transitive. No more of those crazy loops we saw with Condorcet.
Exactly. Arrow was looking for this magic formula, this function, that could take any set of logically consistent individual preferences and turn it into a single logically consistent social preference. And here's where things get really interesting. This is where he introduced his famous set of conditions, these things that seem totally reasonable at first glance. He basically said, look, any good social welfare function should have these properties.
So what were these apparently apparently no-brainer conditions that turned out to be so tricky.
All right, the first one is called unrestricted domain, which sounds very fancy, but it's actually pretty simple. It just means that our social welfare function should be able to handle any logically possible set of individual preferences. It doesn't matter how weird or diverse people's rankings are, the system should be able to take them as input and produce a social ordering. The idea here is that we shouldn't put any limits on what people are allowed to want. As Arrow said, if we're not going to make any assumptions about what people's preferences are going to be, our function needs to be able to deal with any possible combination of preferences. And it's important to understand that this is about the range of preferences over a given set of choices, not about the choices themselves.
Yeah, that makes sense. It would be pretty weird to have a system that only works if people like certain things and not others. What's the next one?
The second one is social ordering, which we've talked about a bit already. It just says that whatever ranking our social welfare function spits out, it's got to be a weak ordering itself. It needs to be complete and transitive, no cycles allowed. Arrow thought this was super important because it reflects rational decision-making, making sure that the order in which choices are made doesn't change the final outcome.
So we need a system that can handle any consistent set of individual preferences, and the outcome has to be a consistent social ranking. What else did Arrow come up with?
All right, number 3 is weak Pareto. This one is pretty straightforward. It just says that if everyone in society prefers X to Y, then the social ranking should also prefer X to Y. Basically, if everyone agrees on something, the social outcome should reflect that. Even Arrow was like, yeah, this one's pretty obvious. He said denying it would be like saying we're going to systematically deny people what they want.
That seems pretty basic for any system that claims to be democratic, right?
Mm-hmm.
If everybody agrees, the social choice should reflect that.
Yeah, exactly. Number 4 is non-dictatorship. This one's a biggie, like a cornerstone of democratic thought. It says there can't be one single person who always gets their way no matter what everybody else wants. Now, it's important to be clear about what Arrow means by dictator. It's not just someone who's influential, it's someone whose preference automatically becomes the social preference no matter what anyone else thinks. So even if everybody else prefers, like apples, and the dictator doesn't care about apples versus oranges, if the dictator says, I want oranges over bananas, then society must prefer oranges to bananas. Everyone else's preferences only matter when the dictator doesn't have a strong preference.
So it's not just about someone having a lot of influence. It's about their preference automatically winning, like a trump card.
Exactly. And now for the final condition, the one that often sparks the most debate. It's called independence of irrelevant alternatives, or IIA for short. This one's a bit trickier. It says that when we're comparing two choices, like X and Y, the social preference between them should only depend on how people feel about X and Y, and not on how they feel about some other irrelevant choice. So if you prefer Italian food to Mexican food, that preference shouldn't change just because, I don't know, a Thai restaurant opens up down the street.
I see the quotation marks around irrelevant there, implying that it might not be so straightforward. Could you give me a more philosophical example?
Okay, so imagine we're trying to decide between two policies, A and B, and based on everyone's preferences between A and B, society prefers A over B. Now, let's say we throw a third policy into the mix, policy C. IIA says that whether or not we include C, or how people feel about C compared to A and B, it shouldn't change the social preference between A and B, as long as people's preferences between A and B themselves stay the same. Basically, it's saying that if we're just trying to decide between A and B, what's going on with C shouldn't matter. But as you pointed out, it can be really hard to say what's truly irrelevant in real-world decision-making. Like, imagine a political election where a new candidate enters the race. That can totally change how people feel about the two original candidates, even if their preferences between those two haven't actually changed.
So we've got these 5 seemingly reasonable conditions: unrestricted domain, social ordering, weak Pareto, non-dictatorship, and independence of irrelevant alternatives. What did Arrow discover when you tried to figure out if any system could actually satisfy all of them at the same time?
Well, what he found was pretty shocking, especially for people who were really optimistic about collective decision-making. He proved that if you have more than 2 choices to choose from, it's mathematically impossible to create a social welfare function that satisfies all 5 of these conditions. It can't be done.
Wow. So it's not that we just haven't found the right system yet. He proved that no such system can exist if we want to hold on to these ideas of fairness and rationality. That's crazy.
It is. It's a fundamental limitation, baked into the very fabric of how we combine preferences. It's not just that one voting system is bad or another is good. Arrow's theorem says that there's something about the logic of making group decisions that just doesn't line up with these basic ideas of fairness and rationality, at least not all the time.
And this really gets to the heart of that original philosophical question, right? The challenges we imagine when trying to create that perfect system for society to make choices. Arrow showed that those challenges aren't just like practical problems to overcome. They're baked into the logic of collective decision-making itself.
Yeah, and this is where the philosophical implications get really interesting. Like the Stanford Encyclopedia points out, Arrow's theorem really goes against those Enlightenment ideals of, like, the will of the people and a perfectly rational society. If you can't have a system that's fair, that takes everyone's desires and combines them into this rational social outcome, then what does that mean for democracy?
Yeah, it makes you think, doesn't it? The article even mentions this guy Riker, who basically said that Arrow's theorem shows that democracy, at least the idea of a government that truly reflects the will of the people, is an incoherent illusion. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is. But while Riker's interpretation is, let's say, on the pessimistic side, it really highlights the problem Arrow's theorem throws at us. It challenges those nice, neat ideas we have about how collective decision-making is supposed to work. But, and this is really important, not everyone agrees that Arrow's conditions are absolutely set in stone. Some philosophers and theorists think that maybe, just maybe, we can loosen up some of those conditions a bit, and that might open up some possibilities for better systems.
So the conversation didn't just end with Arrow, right? There's been a lot of back and forth about those conditions and whether we could maybe tweak them a little to find something that works better in practice.
Exactly. For example, that unrestricted domain condition. It says that we have to be ready to handle any possible combination of preferences. But maybe, just maybe, there are some situations where we have good reasons to believe that people's preferences will fall within a certain range, not just anything goes. Like, think about something simple, like choosing the temperature for a bowl of porridge. Let's say everyone has a temperature that they like best, their ideal temperature, and the further you get from that ideal, the less they like it. That's called having single-peaked preferences. And it turns out that if you assume preferences are going to be like that, then some voting methods, like majority voting, can actually give you consistent results, and results that seem fair too.
So if we have reasons to believe that people's preferences will have some kind of pattern, maybe we can find systems that get around Arrow's impossibility result.
Right. And figuring out, like, what are the philosophical justifications for assuming certain kinds of preferences? And what kind of decision-making systems would work best for those? That's a whole big area of research in social choice theory.
And what about that independence of irrelevant alternatives condition, that IIA? That one seemed particularly controversial. If people tried to figure out what happens if you relax that condition a bit.
Oh, absolutely. Actually, a lot of voting methods that people use in the real world, like the board account, they actually violate IIA. In a board account, you rank all the candidates, and then you get points based on where they are in your ranking. The thing is, your preference between two candidates can be affected by how you ranked other candidates, even ones that seem irrelevant to that particular choice. Now, this violates IIA, but people who like board accounts say, hey, it takes into account more information about how strongly people feel about things, which is something that Arrow's framework doesn't really deal with. They argue that sometimes board accounts give you results that just feel more fair and representative. But the encyclopedia also points out that methods like this can be gamed. People can try to manipulate the system by misrepresenting their preferences to get a better outcome for themselves.
So, like, every attempt to fix the problem seems to come with its own set of trade-offs, new challenges, both philosophical and practical.
That's social choice theory for you. And it shows you just how deep and complex Arrow's finding really was. But people have explored other ways around the problem, too. Some have said, what if we look at more than just people's rankings? What if we let them express how strongly they feel about things? Remember, Arrow limited his framework to those ordinal preferences, where it's just about the order and not the intensity. But what if people could, like, give scores to different choices?
Like rating different policies on a scale of 1 to 10 instead of just saying which one they like better.
Right. As the Stanford Encyclopedia talks about, there are these methods like median grading that might be able to get around Arrow's theorem by using that extra information, even though they're still dealing with rankings in a sense and not like some super precise measure of how much utility each person gets. And what's interesting is that even Arrow himself admitted later on that his original theorem didn't really account for these kinds of grading systems and that they raise a whole bunch of new philosophical questions about how we make collective decisions.
I love that even Arrow acknowledged that his own framework, might have had limitations.
It shows how ideas evolve, how they build on each other. And you know what? It turns out that Arrow's framework can be applied to a ton of other situations where you're trying to combine different opinions or judgments. It's not just about voting. Like, you could use it to combine expert opinions on some factual matter or to evaluate different options based on multiple criteria. You could even use it in debates about philosophy of science, like how to decide which scientific theory is best.
It's amazing how broad the impact of his work has been.
It is, and that's why understanding Arrow's theorem is so important, especially if you're into philosophy. It forces you to really think about what rationality means, what fairness means in these situations where we're trying to combine preferences, and whether we can ever really have a social will that's both coherent and representative while still respecting individual freedom.
This has been a really deep dive into some pretty heady stuff, but I think we've managed to unpack the core of Arrow's theorem, those fundamental conditions, and some of the ways that philosophers and theorists have responded to it.
I agree. And now you have this really solid understanding of one of the most influential ideas in social choice theory. It's like a key that unlocks a whole world of debates about democracy and collective decision-making, not just in philosophy, but in all sorts of fields.
So to wrap things up, here's something to think about. Think back to those 5 conditions Arrow laid out: unrestricted domain, social ordering, weak Pareto, non-dictatorship, and independence of irrelevant alternatives. Which of those do you think is most important for a fair and reasonable decision-making system? And which one, if any, would you be willing to give up on to get a system that works better in the real world? I mean, really think about it. What do your answers say about what you believe about individual freedom, about social rationality, about what a good society even is? It's a question worth pondering.
And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, I highly recommend checking out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Arrow's theorem. It's a fantastic starting point for exploring all the nuances and debates surrounding his work. There's this whole vast body of literature out there in philosophy, economics, political science, all grappling with the implications of his theorem. And if you want to go even deeper, you might want to check out the sections on possibilities and reinterpretations. They explore all sorts of alternative approaches and ways to move beyond that initial impossibility result.
And that's it for today's deep dive. See you next time.
See you next time.